So I'm not really plugging anything. I just want to say that I miss you all over in Seattle, and I'm really glad, Lee, that you picked me as your very first guinea pig. I think this is super fun, and it's great that you can share people's stories in a fun, digestible, and short format.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for showing up to our very first Educative session. My name is Lee Ngo and I represent Educative. Educative makes it easy for authors to provide interactive and adaptive courses for software developers. And these sessions are a multi-episodic campaign to engage people in the developer world and about their coding experiences. My very first guest is a dear friend of mine that I've met through both the technology and entrepreneurial communities. Her name is Ewelina Prockow. And today we're going to talk about avoiding fires by managing stakeholder expectations. In one sentence, this is essentially a talk about her experiences, both as an entrepreneur and as a product manager. But I'm going to go ahead and let her talk about that a little bit more. Ewelina, thank you so much for being part of our very first session.
Hi, everybody. Lee, I'm honored that you reached out to me. I think this is such a great idea to share these little stories in our community.
Well, thank you so much for that as well. Without further ado, let's begin. Ewelina, you've had quite an eclectic professional career so far. Let's start with your first experiences in coding and in product, especially since you seem to dwell quite consistently in that space between business and engineering. So how did you first get into your field?
Yeah, I had this really awesome opportunity to start a business through some family friends. And after that, I wanted to pursue something on my own. And I was doing some design with marketing materials and getting into web development. So I moved to Seattle to join that community since there was just a lot of awesome meetups and a great startup community, something I was interested in. But yeah, from there, I just started doing projects with entrepreneurs and kind of noticing some of their needs. And also working with my partner who's a software developer. So learning through him and working with entrepreneurs to help them with their projects.
Wonderful, wonderful. And from there, it seems like you've identified a particular topic for today, and that is about fires, right? Of course, for many people within the developer world, they have a very clear idea of what that could mean. But let's define what a fire is succinctly, and then jump into some of the fires that you've had to deal with in this line of work that you're in.
Yeah, I think fires are those undesirable situations, and I think they happen a lot in startups and in software development in general. I think, we're working with a lot of people with many unknowns, and surprises come up, and those bad surprises are the fires. So that's the short definition.
Very cool. So sounds like you've dealt with a few of them. So like, what is like one extreme scenario that you had to deal with? Or I guess more specifically with the relation to the topic at hand, a situation that could have been a major fire for you had you seen it through?
Well, I think that first you have to deal with a fire to identify one and prevent one. So maybe I'll start with like the bad scenarios. Definitely, in building a business, I've had some customer experiences where there was miscommunication and misalignment of expectations. And, I've delivered on a project where a customer was tremendously unhappy and had to recover from that case. So, think all-nighter working on a project to try to get as much of the requirements updated so that person can get what they really asked for. And then, in the case of like a larger company, prior to working at Guidewire, which is where I am right now in Poland, I worked for Avalera, and we, definitely had experiences where there were stakeholder expectations, and there are big delays and lots of big conversations about what to do. So those are some of the, the negative scenarios that you're trying to avoid. And then as far as like some great examples of scenarios where I was able to kind of prevent the fire, you know, in the entrepreneurial setting, I've had entrepreneurs come up to me and tell me, hey, I would love for you to build me a Google and a Facebook for legal. So, you know, in that case, it's really a matter of communication and ensuring that you're asking, okay, where do we start? You know, what are you really trying to solve? If we're going to gain value and build something in a short period, what would be that first value that we're going to deliver? So just breaking down the problem and really asking a lot of questions to understand where that entrepreneur is coming from. That's one example where I was able to prevent a fire. And really that was like just a huge component of what I did with my agency. Right. And then in terms of like a larger organization, you know, I've entered a project where we've tried something and we failed at it miserably. And typically organizations are totally fine kind of accepting that some things will go wrong. But then, you know, we signed up to do it again, yet bigger, without necessarily making any changes before to learn from and really understand that we can succeed. So yeah, doing like a big project where you're making a big change and the last time you failed is not recommended.
Got it. Do you think though, like in all of your experiences, that a lot of the problems that come up are inevitable problems? Like, is it just kind of fundamental to the tension between the productive tension, what it would say, between business and engineering, that business has its appetite to do things that might be a bit of a stretch, while engineering, their responsibility is to be pragmatic and feasible in some ways? Is that a potentially accurate way to describe why these things happen? And if so, is there anything that can be done to either abate them or prevent them altogether?
Yeah, to some extent, I think you're right. There's a natural tension between design, engineering, and product, or the business. And the product manager, you know, is the person who kind of sits in the middle of that tension and really gets to understand the problem and help create a direction and an understanding for everybody. But I think if you run into disasters, there is some point where you failed, because that is exactly the point of the product manager, is that you're there to ensure there's clear communication, clear understanding, we understand where we're headed. So of course there are, you know, failures in general in software development and in entrepreneurship. So you're testing a hypothesis and it turns out like, no, you're wrong. Like customers don't want to behave this way and therefore you run a different project. But I wouldn't call that a fire. You know, that is just more, you're taking small risks and you're getting to learn from them. The fires that I would really try to prevent are those fires where there was miscommunication, there's a big commitment made, and suddenly everybody's scrambling because someone's expectations weren't met. This also happens in software, but you know, the point of the agile process and the Scrum process is to get better at that and avoid like really big disappointments.
Fair. I just want to remind, I'm nearing the end of at least of my usual set questions, but encourage anybody else in the audience, if they have any questions, please like submit them, especially when it comes to questions related to your own inquiries into this field, which is, you know, an increasingly more common thing that emerges in the developing world. So for those who are actually interested in perhaps either transitioning from developer communities or from engineering altogether and want to explore more of the product side of things, what are your own personal recommendations? You know, for you, you've been working in product, if I can say, like about 4 or 5 years now officially with that official title, but probably have been doing a lot more as well. What are some of the things that you've learned that could enable others to be successful in this field?
I mean, definitely active listening. So, and reaching out to get information from others. So I think the biggest thing about product management is that you really understand where everyone's coming from. And then you're able to synthesize that information and share it with others so they're not blind to the knowledge that you have. So I think you're at the center of communication, and that is the biggest thing you can do to succeed.
And are there particular styles or tools that you would even recommend when it comes to how people communicate in order to maximize that kind of success? Knowing that there is a lot of diversity and there's a lot of, not just in, backgrounds, but in opinions and work styles as well.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really good to have some structure to your communication. And I think, whenever you join an organization, you have to assess what it looks like and what you can put in place in order to enable better flow of information. If you're at a tiny company, it probably means you're all talking together. Maybe, in the current COVID world, you set up, discussions via Zoom, and you have appropriate Slack channels for different topics. But small organizations kind of enable you to have just a freer, easier flow of information. Right. As soon as you're scaling, you really have to come up a little more with a procedure and some specific structure, because you just have so many more people to talk to, and you don't want to have those meetings with 50 people and everybody's trying to talk.
Got it. And you've worked with small companies and you've worked with very large companies, especially as of late. Do you find that the style of product management changes in an exponential way when it comes to how many people you work with? And what are some of the starker distinctions, I should say? What are some of the starker distinctions when it comes to working in small to big companies in product?
Yeah, I do think there's a big shift. Larger organizations have a little more room for risk, so you can not develop a project, and there are certainly some consequences to your reputation or, to your roadmap. But a larger company can take some failures, has some room to absorb them. Whereas if you're working for a startup, you're really focused on doing small experiments and delivering value, because not delivering value to your customer can mean that you're not able to fundraise or you're not able to sell your product. And so that, success is really crucial in the early days. And so you're just very much focused on execution and experimentation. And communication is fairly easy because you're a small team. In a big company, I think it really shifts towards communicating a lot. As I said, there's some room to absorb risk, but at the same time, you're more relationship building and ensuring that there's trust between teams and between team members. And you're working towards building towards predictability. So it's very much a different type of a job. And I think if you're headed for a bigger company, definitely gear up for patience, and, setting aside that time to make sure you really understand everything and kind of the background and the core issues that are happening at hand.
Awesome. Ewelina, believe it or not, but we are actually in the last minute of our session. And you'll be the very first person to have achieved the honor of being able to make any kind of shameless plug or any kind of announcement that you'd like to our community. And and on our end, we're just here to honor that. So what would you like to say to everyone?
Well, I've been in Poland for a few weeks. I had this big transition of having worked in Seattle for a while, which I absolutely love, and then trying out something totally different. So I'm not really plugging anything. I just want to say that I miss you all over in Seattle, and I'm really glad, Lee, that you picked me as your very first guinea pig. I think this is super fun, and it's great that you can share people's stories in a fun, digestible, and short format.
Awesome. Ewelina, thank you, of course. Right back at you. You and I have been through quite a lot as colleagues and friends. And I just even I like to describe you as a war buddy, because you're someone who I've learned a lot by watching you go through your own entrepreneurial journey and also your own technical journey. And it is absolutely an honor for you to be our first session. And that just about wraps it up for us in our very first session. So thank you so much to Ewelina Prockow for being our first guest. And also thank you to Educative for supporting this entire endeavor. So thank you all so much for being part of this. We hope to see you again. This is Lee from Educative. Happy learning, everybody. Bye now.
Bye all.
Thanks so much for watching our session. Be sure to watch more sessions below and subscribe to our channel to get the latest stories. Also, follow us on social media and check us out at educative.io. Happy learning.